Hello and welcome to Saltgrass. We have another episode with Zoe Scoglio in the studio with me as we talk about the Castlemaine Commons project, which she's been working on, which is an audio project. She's been collecting interviews from our community about community collectivism and coming together and resilience and support and all of that sort of thing. So yeah, we'll have a chat with Zoe in a minute. We've got two or three interviews to share with you today from two local people who have different perspectives on what it means to be part of a community. Before we get started with the show, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Jara country, home of the Djadjurrung people who have been caretakers and protectors of this land for tens of thousands of years. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Salt of the earth. Salt. Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change. Saltgrass.
Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com. All right. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, Allie.
Welcome to the show again. And
Thank you.
Can you maybe just give us a recap about what this project is and what you've been working on?
Yeah, so I got the chance to come in a fortnight ago and have a chat with you, which was great, about this project I've been working on with the Castlemaine Commons here. And during these sort of lockdown times, I've been collecting stories by going for walks and talks with people in the community to collect stories around community care and community organising, to kind of get a sense of this place that I've only recently moved to as a new person living here, and also in response to the increasing need to care for each other and collectivise in times of increasing precarity, also brought on through the climate crisis and the pandemic, which has very much shown our need for each other in order to survive and thrive. And so today I've got some excerpts of some conversations that I had with local ecologist Karl Just. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Yep, I believe you are.
And local writer and historian Robyn Annear. Had a really great time walking with them and hearing about what came to mind. So very meandering conversations and strolls. So yeah, there's just a few little clips here. I don't know if we want to dive straight in or if you want to hear a bit more, Allie, about the project.
Yeah, look, I think the thing to mention here is, again, we're really inviting people to give us feedback on what you're hearing and what you see emerging out of these various audio interviews that you've collected, Zoe.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of ways to do it. The text in line, we'll be able to read out whatever you text into that number, we'll read it out on air so people can hear what you've said. And the other thing we've done is create a Facebook event. So it's something you can find on Facebook. Either look at the Saltgrass page or the Castlemaine Commons page, and you'll be able to find that event. And we'll be trying to direct conversation to happen in that event page. So if you express interest or something, say you're going in inverted commas to that event, you'll be able to interact with us via the event page as well.
Yeah, this is very much the beginning of hopefully an ongoing inquiry and conversation that can happen. And it's quite a broad invitation. So I think usually when there's times of urgency and crisis, there's a necessary need to act. But I think my approach to this collection of stories is more understanding what examples have already existed in the area, but thinking about community and the cultures that form and the friendships and relationships and solidarities that form, that play out and can support people in times of need, but also in their daily doings. And so to sort of look at, how people have collectivised and cared for each other in order to make things possible that wouldn't otherwise be possible. So today's session as well, by chatting to Karl Just, for example, who's a local ecologist, was also very much opening up that frame to think of community not just being humans, but the more than human ecologies that we're part of.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. So we'll hear from Karl in a minute, but I thought we'd start with one of the interviews you did with Robyn Annear, who is, as you said, a historian, and she has worked with the local library for many, many years. And so she's got some perspectives on what community organising has looked like historically, and I thought that would be a really great place to start with her descriptions of some of the really, like, only as far back as white colonial history has been, but some of the ways that this town even formed via community getting together and advocating for particular things. So we'll start with that one, and then we'll come back and share some more stories after this. So this is Robyn Annear having a talk about the history of collective action in the Castlemaine region.
Yeah, and in a town like Castlemaine, you just, as you look back across the history, you can see from the real fundamentals in the gold rush days, the needs that weren't being met. You know, very early on, groups got together, public meetings were held, subscriptions were raised to sow the seeds of a hospital and schools and a market and things like that, because, you know, they were just the staples that you needed to make a civilised place and to bring your family to, obviously.
That's so fascinating to hear. I don't know much at all about the history. Do you know kind of examples of how people went around about doing that in those times?
Well, I mean, in the earliest times and in the times of the monster meeting, you know, it literally was putting placards on trees. You know, the town took shape and had a heart very early on, so you'd put placards around the market square, which was one of the first sort of gathering places. And you know, it was a while before there was a newspaper, but once there was, things became easier that way. But, you know, word of mouth, word of mouth worked. People had a lot to do with one another, and you know, had connections across the goldfield through back home connections or religious connections or whatever. Of course, that was the other thing, was churches. Churches were formed very early on, so that would have been another way that brought people together to say, let's build a hospital and so on, through their church meetings.
Yeah, because there are so many churches here.
Yeah. But see, that was the time that was. I mean, it wasn't just how you practiced your spiritual beliefs, but it was how you formed a community. It was how you formed a community, how you found the people who shared your values and worked with them towards something. And in the first instance, it would be building the church itself, but beyond that, it was, you know, community-wide. So, yeah, churches were a stand-in for all sorts of other institutions that we'd have today. That wouldn't be as permanent, that wouldn't have such troublesome architecture to upkeep.
Yeah, it's interesting where today, you know, being much more secular in lots of ways, what are the institutions or the spaces that can hold community in such a way with sort of deep meaning, but also care and a whole sort of way of fostering connection.
Well, yeah, and I mean, some of it does seem to come down to having a building. I mean, I think they knew that you build this building and not only will they come, but something will also stay. Same with the library, in a way. And, you know, now our values and concerns and priorities, as they're looking at the owls, I guess, are shifting. And perhaps we do, you know, our things can be done in any building. Oh, up there, right at the top there. Those white and grey shapes.
I heard the babies are also somewhere. Out and about.
Oh, really? Because we had one. It might have been one of their babies at the hospital.
Yeah. Just going back to the comment you made about sort of gold rush times and the early institutions that were formed, or like people advocating for. You said a hospital. Yep. What was the other thing?
Schools.
Schools.
The market, although that was always seen as a local government or a government responsibility, but, you know, it was very much formalising a market was very key to people's vision of how you formed a town and how you gave a heart to your town. So those things were important. But, you know, really a hospital from the word go, it was like, we need, people were always getting sick, people were always getting old, lots of accidents in those times and lots of illness. People needed a place to die apart from anything else, and someone to be with them when they did. So the hospital was just seen as so important from the outset.
Do you know if there was much resistance met? Hello. If there was much resistance met in terms of the community trying to advocate and instate some of these?
No. It was always welcome. I mean, these were the markers of civilization, and really the government itself was very keen to see the goldfields settle down and become a more civilised place. This is a place full of, adventurers, as they call them, who are only interested in their own ambitions. So things like that, starting institutions, old world institutions that were about caring for your fellows, were always welcomed with, government grants and so on. But, the community had to seed support for it and usually put in some money, subscribe money to kick the thing off. It was really happening on the ground. It wasn't, people who'd been born to rule sort of assuming their rightful positions. It was happening in Britain to an extent that people were rising up out of the protest movements or out of the industrial towns. But here it happened in a hurry, and as soon as our parliament was established in the mid-1850s, it had those people in its midst from its formation, and that, it did make a big difference. And it made a big difference to how, because they came from the goldfields or from rural Victoria, they didn't see it as a city-centric enterprise. They really knew the conditions on the ground. The push very early on was for government, whether it was local government or colonial government, to adopt some of these caring roles in an official way, to provide funding for, hospitals and other caring institutions, schools and even just local government, to make these things happen. They even had to agitate to have a local government. But with all the accretions, with all the bureaucratic accretions that then happen, so they embraced that government's adoption of their concerns and their priorities at that time. The thing becomes unrecognisable and it ceases to be your own caring model pretty quickly, I think, and certainly after this passage of time, it does. It's hugely disconnected. Which is why, as you say, we have local groups popping up, trying to address needs at a local level. But it's, but that sense of permanence is lacking. So even when an organisation gets some funding or some support, it's year to year. No one builds a building with a steep roof and solid bricks. Solid until the copies eat them. It's year to year and manage as best you can, and we guarantee nothing. We don't really believe in you that much. So that's a big difference.
Yeah.
That sense of permanence. This is here to stay. We will believe in this or support this forever. Has been a big shift. A necessary one in some cases, but.
Yeah.
And it's again where libraries are an outlier. They're trying to bridge that the passage from the old way of doing things to adapting to new community needs. And are the more interesting for that, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point you make. And also as an artist who's always applying for grants and art projects, and the level of competition and individualism that then is fostered because of the way the funding is distributed and the models that exist. And, in these times where, there's the need for different forms of caring for each other or pooling resources or understanding not just an individual project but how it can benefit or be connected in with others who maybe have similar projects, and rather than acting in competition, like how to find out about each other or find ways to connect.
Right, and and if you were to, imagine that in a gold rush tent model, you'd have someone who would attend to the drudgery perhaps for some percentage of the time, and you'd take turns at it and get to do your creative thing or the rest of the time. It could be like you say, and it would do away with that to an extent, with that competitiveness, which must be the enemy of creativity.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
And also of community.
Yes.
So
building
up solidarity.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think also that another point in that comment you made was just the need for a longer term commitment of values or ethics.
So I mean, part of that is the fact that, you know, the paradigm now, which it certainly wasn't then, was change is the only constant. It's the only thing that we can rely on. So, you know, a government embracing that just says, well, you know, we support your project this year, but we're going to be more interested in something else next year. And you just got to ride with that. And also, of course, partisanship. So I think in governments, I mean, there's always been divisions between the two sides, or more than two in governments, but with the increasing partisanship, you know, what one government supports, the next government will almost make a policy of not supporting. And that didn't used to be so much the case. It was more like, we share these constant values.
There you go. That was Robyn Annear. She said some really great things about the history of people getting together and collectivising, really, and gathering as a community to agitate for changes, especially right at the very beginning of settlement, white settlement here, when it was really a wild gold rush kind of era, the Wild West in Australia, really, the Wild South maybe is how we'd describe it here. We did get a text in from someone as they were listening to that saying, "Love you guys," which is nice. Thanks. So really, one of the things that stood out for me right at the end there was the idea of sort of that competitive process of getting grants and funding that we exist in these days is kind of the enemy of creativity, and then you said, and of community. And that really resonated with me because I just put in a grant application today. But I, you know, as someone who's worked in the creative fields and someone who's worked in community, I know what a constant stress and struggle it is for community groups to stay funded and stay motivated. And sometimes it just feels like a hamster wheel of you employ someone to do the funding so that you can employ someone to do the fundraising. Do you know what I mean? Like it becomes really self-defeating in some ways, so that the group that's trying to affect change in our community is so taken up with trying to raise money that they can't actually do the work that they're there to do as effectively as they'd like to, you know.
Totally. I think there's a big level of burnout and exhaustion all around the place, but also in a lot of volunteer and community organising where people are really passionate. But it's a hard slog. It's very difficult to try and get things moving sometimes. Yeah. And to get support and financial support to back it. And
that idea of competitiveness, which is a very capitalist idea, is like we're all in an equal race, supposedly, and we're all competing against each other to succeed. It's a very, I don't know, I feel like it is very counter to what it takes for a community really to be strong, because that takes everyone to be interwoven and trusting each other and not feeling like we're enemies or competing for the same resources, but that we're helping each other do the things that we all want to see happen. Yeah, it's a really different mindset, isn't it?
Definitely. I think that sounds really interesting to sort of hear that example of early gold rush times and the sort of, what were they called? Adventure, the sort of deep individualism of everyone trying to carve out some wealth for their own, to understanding all of the needs and the care needed for people's, to survive, and then the shifting of instituting forms of care and community. But that sort of shift also nowadays, thinking about, this highly neoliberalised way of living and the sort of competitive nature that is so ingrained in our dominant Western culture, and thinking
and even
about
just the privatisation of so many things that used to be a collectively owned via the government sometimes institution, like our medical health and our education and all of those things used to be collectively owned, even if it was via the government.
Yeah, I mean, we're very lucky in that there are, there's Medicare, there are social services and things, like, compared to what it was like then. But that's obviously becoming increasingly eroded. So I think I found it really great chatting to Robyn. We were walking through the botanical gardens, by the way, doing some laps
I love those
vigorous
moments where you
laps.
said hello to someone as they walked past. And
Yeah, you always see a familiar face, even, in the couple of years that I've been there.
Yeah.
Been here, I'm noticing that. And some powerful owls that we stopped to have a look at on the way.
Yeah, fabulous.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
go on.
Oh, there's lots I can talk about, and I think there's a lot that links in with this next clip that we're going to share, which is Karl Just talking about the endangered local eltham copper butterfly and the symbiotic relationship it has with an ant species and the sweet burstia plant that.
Yes, and it's so interesting how, he didn't know what you've been talking about with Robyn Annear, but he instantly went to those same themes of competitive versus cooperative. And I think you'll hear that as you hear this piece. So this is Karl Just, and it's a shorter piece. It's only 3 or 4 minutes long, so we'll be back in just a second. But have a listen to this and see if you can hear the links between this and what Robyn had just been talking about.
It's funny that I think our own ideas about how species fit together often reflect our own kind of way of seeing the world. So it's funny, the theory of evolution, it focuses on competition between species, but I think in Australia particularly it's quite obvious that kind of species collaborating and working together is actually really essential for their survival. That's how a lot of species have managed to get through really rough climates and dry times and that kind of thing through actually helping each other rather than just this idea of competition. So my favourite example is probably the eltham copper butterfly. It's a threatened butterfly species that we have in Castlemaine. But the eltham copper, it's got this amazing relationship with a species of plant and a species of ant, and it can only survive if it's got those other two species. And so the way that relationship works is that the butterfly actually lays its eggs at the base of the Beceria plant, which is like a kind of small to medium spiny shrub with really beautiful white flowers, really nectar-rich flowers. So it lays the eggs down the base of the plant, and the ants actually have their nest down at the base of the plant, and they actually lay their eggs pretty much where at the ant's nest. And a lot of other species, humans do it as well. There's a lot of communication that happens via pheromones, so it's kind of like chemicals are released that can actually, transmit information, different to using language, but more using kind of chemical signals. And so when the butterfly is laying its eggs, there's, these pheromones are released, and the ants seem to get quite excited, and they come out and actually receive the egg of the butterfly and take it into their nest. And then the caterpillar actually hatches in the nest of the ants, and every night when it's old enough, what it does over the kind of winter and spring months, the caterpillar will come up at night time and feed on the foliage of the sweet Beceria plant. And if you pick that caterpillar up and put it on any other plant, it wouldn't survive. It wouldn't eat anything but the Beceria leaves. It really is quite, a lot of butterfly species are very exclusive in terms of what plant they'll eat. And so only wants the Beceria leaves. And so every night the caterpillar is going up on this journey, and the ants follow it and essentially look after the caterpillar. So there's other things that could actually attack the caterpillar, like wasps or other, more aggressive ants and this kind of thing. But these little ants called the Notonkus ant, they swarm all over the caterpillar's back while the caterpillar's just feeding on the Beceria leaves, and they protect it from other species. And in return, the caterpillar's got these kind of glands on its back where it excretes these kind of sugary substance, like a kind of nectar, and the ants are feeding on that as well. So there's like this kind of exchange happening where the caterpillar is getting protected, but the ants are also getting a bit of a reward. So it's kind of cool how there's you need all three species: the Beceria plant, you need the Notonkus ant for the eltham copper butterfly to actually be able to survive anywhere. And we're just walking up below Kalimna Park, and there's quite a few populations up in these hills here. There's so much that we still don't even know about these species. We're still discovering more information, and a lot of it I think has been pretty recent in a way, in terms of how the relationship works. But like I said, there's so much we still don't know about how the ants communicate with the butterfly and how the relationships can work. We're often we kind of always seeing things through the lens of how we see through our language, but there's a whole other ways of being that are beyond our comprehension.
That was Karl Just, and talking about the eltham copper butterfly, which is a a species of animal that is symbiotic, as he was explaining, and it's something that's, you know, we've had an Eltham Copper Butterfly Festival here in Castlemaine. It's such a wonderful and rare thing, and I think it's such a beautiful example of exactly what Karl was talking about, of that collaborative, and how much stronger you are when you're collaborating with another species than when you're just trying to, you know, survive on your own. Survival of the fittest as a myth of evolution.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of integrating, like Western science has now been catching up in terms with you know, with Indigenous and other non-Western paradigms and knowledge systems, in terms of understanding ourselves as interdependent and part of a greater ecology rather than the hierarchy of survival of the fittest. But it's about ingraining, now that we know that's how ecologies work and how life functions, it's like, how do we integrate that knowledge into the ways we organise ourselves in our more human realms. And I loved this example of interdependence, how deeply we need each other, also across different, so these are obviously different species, but this idea of community not just being a monocultural thing, not just the one entity, but that solidarities are needed and relationships are needed across difference. And that's, I think, a really key thing, where you can hold that, unique kind of features of different communities or different species within the same space. And I think that's a beautiful example with the ant and the sweet excretion of the butterfly as it's resting. Yeah. And I think the other key thing that I find really interesting in both of those excerpts that we just played with Robyn and Karl is the sort of longevity or the duration. Both talk about really like long-term support structures that are needed for supporting community and cultures to thrive. Robyn, for example, was talking about churches, the building of, you know, big buildings, and how much they indicate a vision of a long-term support structure for a community and a certain set of values and ethics and ways of being in relation with each other. And Karl's example of these endemic species that are specific to this region, and the ants and the butterfly, the Eltham copper butterfly, only requiring only each other. They won't eat any other plant, only this very specific sweet Basaria plant that is specific to here. So these, again, are relationships that are formed over such long periods of time. So, you know, thinking about what are the support structures that we need in terms of adapting to change and changing our own cultures, in terms of creating support structures that can last over longer periods of
those
time.
Depths of time. And the next piece we'll play from Karl explores that idea of relationships that have existed for like vast amounts of time. And we'll get to that in a minute. But I think what we'll do is break and have a bit of a song first, so that everyone can go to the loo and do what you need to do. So we'll be back in a minute, and we'll have a few more minutes of Karl talking about different ecological relationships and how that, you know, hopefully reflects back to us what's possible in terms of community, really. And we've also got another short clip from Robyn, if we have time, talking about some examples of community action and, you know, self-advocating communities that then support each other long term, and how that can change and grow over time. So hopefully we'll be able to fit that one in. But let's listen to a song first. This is your choice, Zoe. This is Beverly, Glenn-Copeland.
Yeah, Sunset Village is the name of the song, and my friend Casey put me onto this song and this artist, and it's a very relaxing song, as you'll find out, called Let It Go is the key phrase that's said. But I think in relationship, actually, to what we just heard, for me, I've been thinking a lot about support structures and how to feel safe enough and held enough to actually relax and let it go and flow. So if you're listening and you're in a space where you want to just chill out for a moment, I invite you to let it go and enjoy this song.
if you're driving, hold on to the wheel and stay focused. But anyone else, it's like, you know, in meditations, they're like, if you're driving, we don't recommend you do this meditation. But everyone else, let go, just relax.
And maybe I'll just also add, in terms of letting it go and support structures, just thinking also about community, like when you feel held and supported, you can chill out and not feel like you have to solve the world by yourself.
I think that's so important. You see so much burnout, and especially in the climate movement, there's a lot of guilt and a lot of personal responsibility, and everyone feels like, you know, it's so much bigger than them. And the idea that all of us together can make change is actually kind of hard to grasp sometimes. Sometimes people feel like it's on me to solve all of the world's problems, and that's just crushing. And otherwise you feel despair because you feel like I alone can't do it. But if you can really, really just lean into this idea that collectively maybe we can do it, that is where hope lies.
Exactly.
Welcome back. You're listening to Saltgrass. And I am in the studio today with Zoe Scoglio, who has been working with Castlemaine Commons on some interview collecting and contemplating what it is to be part of a community and what community resilience really means and what it means when we get together and work together collaboratively, not competitively. So we've listened to a couple of audio pieces already today from Karl Just, who's an ecologist, and also Robyn Annear, who's a historian and writer. That song, by the way, was gorgeous that we just heard. Can you tell us about that song again? Who was it and what was it called?
That was Beverly, Glenn-Copeland, Sunset Village. And for those that were listening, I invited people to relax and let go if they wanted to do so. But more specifically, I was inspired by Karl's story of the Eltham copper butterfly, and it's how it's looked after by the ants that suck on the sweet nectar that as a caterpillar they release, and the ants protect it from wasps and other predators so that the caterpillar can just hang out in its cocoon and
that just sounds kind of ideal to me. You get to be that kid that just like munches away and there's all these things are happening around you to protect you and all you have to do is like be sweet.
Yeah, exactly. It's a nice,
I really like that as an idea.
It's such a great exchange. What a great trade. But also, you know, to be a nice Eltham butter caterpillar hanging out in your cocoon, feeling safe and protected by all these ants as your protectors.
Oh, is it while it's in the cocoon or while it's mooching around, munching on things?
Oh, actually,
both.
Probably, I guess maybe both. Yeah. I'm getting my facts wrong, sorry. I should fact check
these
details, the finer details. Right. I'm not over.
We can invite people, if you know the answer to this question, join us on Facebook. We now have the Castlemaine Commons page and the Saltgrass page. You can comment on either of those, or together we have an events page on Facebook which you can also write comments on and participate, and that's where we'll be giving you the information about upcoming episodes, because this is not our last gig together.
We've got 2 more sessions over the next 2 fortnights where we'll be sharing more excerpts of stories and also hopefully collecting more of your stories and experiences of collective care and community organising.
And if you want to talk to Zoe directly and tell her any stories you might have from your own life that are examples of this, what's that email address that they can email the Castlemaine Commons email address?
Good question. I think it is Castlemaine Commons at gmail.com.
All right, we'll put that on Facebook as well and have it for you next week, definitely. We had it last week, but it's totally
I'm pretty sure that's it.
Yeah, great. So we've got one more piece from Karl now. He's talking about different symbiotic and collaborative kind of relationships that we can see in nature. And you caught up with him at Kalimna Park, didn't you, Zoe?
Yeah, we had a walk towards sunset on the edges of Kalimna Park and Moonlight Flat, and also the wind joined us. You'll be able to hear. If anyone understands wind, please let us know what it was trying to say.
That's great. All right, so this is Karl Just, and we'll be back in a minute after we've had a listen.
Up to about 50 plants on this slope of the emerald lip greenhood. It's a species of Pterostylis.
A type of orchid?
Yeah, a kind of orchid. Yeah, greenhood orchid. I'm not seeing any a waxlip orchid leaf.
Oh yeah, what's that one? Sorry.
It's a waxlip orchid, Glausodia. It's got like a lovely purple flower on itself. But yeah, the orchids are really interesting because they also have these really tight relationships, particularly with different species of fungus and different species of pollinator. So using this one as an example, the emerald lip greenhood, it needs to grow where this particular fungus species is under. It's called a mycorrhizal relationship. So I think it's about 90% of our land plants actually have this reliance on having fungus in the soil. So, and it's only this, talking about how recently this research has happened, it's still so much we don't know, but even, probably the last 30 years, once again, we've become more aware of how much more important, like, the fungus is in the soil. It's not just all about the nutrient balance. It's like fungus is an essential part of our soil. And the way that essentially what happens is that the plant might share certain sugars it's getting from photosynthesis by converting the sunlight into kind of sugar and energy and carbohydrate. Shares that with these almost like these kind of networks of, they're like root-like structures, but they're really tiny. These mycorrhizal fungus. So you imagine these kind of threads through the soil, and they'll connect to the roots of the plant, and the plant can actually share the kind of carbohydrates, the sugars, and then the fungus will get nutrients and things it's getting from like breaking down soil and rotting litter and stuff, and then sharing that with the plant. So a lot of our plants have this relationship, but orchids are really specific in terms they really won't grow unless there's a specific fungus species in the soil. So that's why some of our orchids are really restricted where they grow, because they need the right species of fungus, and the fungus isn't just everywhere. So there's that really interesting relationship happening, and what's also cool about that is that the mycorrhizal fungus might be tapping into a whole network of plants. So where it's getting that nutrients, it might actually be getting kind of, getting some energy from, say, a Basaria plant or a grass or something else, and then it's kind of, siphoning that off and sharing it with the orchid, and the orchid sharing sugars. There's all this stuff happening under the ground. It's been referred to as the wood wide web these days. It's like this idea of there being almost like an internet under the soil. And then also what the orchids really need are different species of pollinator. So, and once again, it's quite specific. So coming back to this emerald lip greenhood, which is a rare species around here, it needs certain species of fungus gnat. And the fungus gnats, they're quite an ancient kind of genus of small gnat. I think a lot of them kind of almost go back to the kind of Gondwanan era, like before Australia actually broke off from New Zealand and Antarctica, like really ancient species of insect. And so once again, unless you have the pollinator in the ecosystem, then you might lose the orchid. But the pollinator is also relying on a whole bunch of other things. So it needs, particularly seems to like the kind of shadier conditions. It might need, say, rotting logs on the ground for it to do its breeding. There's also a lot of spider orchids that have these really amazing relationships as well. We've got the Castlemaine spider orchid, a species named just after the Castlemaine area, which goes as far as the kind of Heathcote area, but it's the main populations are around Castlemaine, and it's this beautiful red spider orchid that we only get in this region, and that's got a similar relationship with a fungus, needing that particular fungus under the soil, and also having relationships with thin-eyed wasps. These species they're kind of like a flower wasp, and they feed on lots of flowers from trees and things, and then they also pollinate the spider orchid. Totally, it's, the connections just fan out, like I said, and there's, I think I've seen really great, like even pollinator diagrams where they show all the different colour lines between different species, and you see that visualised. It's just incredible just seeing how everything is kind of interconnected in that way, and there's so many different kinds of connections in any kind of ecosystem.
There you go. That was Karl Just talking about the ecosystems around some of the invisible, I think, and like really diversely collaborative systems around fungus in the soil, which I think is relatively new knowledge, as he was saying. And it's really, to me, interesting how that works.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing.
Amazing. Yeah.
It really shifts
our
understanding of how things survive and how we support each other.
Yeah. So we're almost reaching the end of the show, but we do have one more piece from Robyn Annear, which I think really ties in with this. And for me, having heard Robyn's one, I'm wondering if you will hear the same thing, people out there listening. What Karl was talking about was how unexpected some of these collaborations are. And what Robyn is about to talk about is the library, community action group that emerged because the library was under threat at a certain point in time and needed community support to advocate for it. And so a group of people got together to form a group called FOCL, F-O-C-L, which is Friends of Castlemaine Library. And she'll tell us all about it. But what I think you'll be able to hear in this story is how the networks that this group, it established itself based on a single purpose, and then with time it's established lots of connections, and some of them are quite unexpected. So have a listen to this, and then we'll be back in a minute to sign off for the end of the hour. So this is Robyn Annear talking about the local library advocacy group, FOCL.
Just delving into the history as I have over time, just such a lot of groups who've risen and then disappeared, who've, created and agitated for, amazing developments and changes from, schools, hospitals to, commemorations of things, and parks like Kalimna and so on. But Friends of the Library started 1995 in response to the Kennett government threat to, it was this thing called compulsory competitive tendering, CCT, where the library staff were going to have to put in a tender to provide the library service. These were just ordinary, a librarian and a couple of library assistants were supposed to create a tender document, and it could be, somebody else could put one in and contest their tender. So it just seemed ludicrous. I mean, it was ludicrous. So initially, FOCL, as it's called, Friends of the Castlemaine Library, was formed, and it was the heart of it was actually the U3A at that time, which was, so many of them were the people who had come here in the 70s and 80s, a lot of ex-school teachers and fiery women, and we had public meetings, hundreds of people just saying, leave our library alone. And that didn't go ahead, the CCT, and then there was this threat from the commissioners to outfit some crappy old factory and move the library in there and do something else with the library, and again FOCL sort of rose up against that. But from there, the organisation, largely as a result of the people who are running it, so Louise Jepson has been president of FOCL for maybe 20 years now. Denise, she came up with the idea that it's important to support the reading of children whose fathers and mothers are in prison in one of the prisons around Castlemaine. And so she obtained funding for a project that's ongoing and has been, I think, for 15 years, where FOCL supplies picture books and takes them into the prison. They hire a worker who goes into the prison and works with men and women, some of whom have struggled to read themselves, and end up recording them reading the story, and then the recording is sent to their children, so mum or dad can still read them a story each day. And this is expanded to really help with reading in the prisons and reading groups and stuff. And that's one of FOCL's main things. So they have these huge book sales and so on, and they do help put money towards things at the library sometimes if needed, but it's less needed than it used to be because there's more government funding, amazingly, than it used to be. So that's the Friends of the Library's main activity these days. So it's really shifted, but I find it inspiring and really heartening that an organisation that is really based around a place that happens to have books in it can broaden its brief that way and take books and reading and all the things that go with that, to a bigger world. So that's FOCL. Like I say, it comes down probably to one person's mission, but it's still, it's still under the name of FOCL, and that grew out of, just the usual thing, an agitation group that arose from a government threat. So that's been over, whatever that's been, nearly 30 years.
That was Robyn Annear talking about the Friends of Castlemaine Library group who have started their life as a advocating for the library group, and have since grown and changed and adapted to supporting so many people in the community in really unexpected ways. For example, helping prisoners keep reading to their children bedtime stories even though they're in jail. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, they're both those two little clips have so many amazing examples and threads between them around the themes that we're exploring today. I think this thing as well of expanding the brief, like there's so much to unpack here, and I know we're coming to the end, but I'm trying to think of like which thread to
pull.
unravel. Yeah, and this expanding the brief thing maybe is also a nice thing to end on, in that Friends of Castlemaine Library, for example, a library being seen as a place for books, but how to expand that notion or take those relationships and friendships and shared sort of passions and expand that to different fields. So similarly, like what other community groups exist, say sports groups, craft groups, whatever, that come together for a shared affinity around something, but with that connection and community that forms, you know, that often can allow another layer of advocating, of supporting, of doing.
Perfect. Yeah. So get in touch and stay tuned. Zoe and I will both be back in a fortnight.
Salt of the earth.
Salt.
Grassroots. Salt of the earth people. Grassroots change.
Saltgrass. Listen to all episodes of Saltgrass on your podcast app or at saltgrasspodcast.com.